Welcome to Birdsong. I'm your host, Caillou Kiora, and in this episode we have David George Haskell joining us. David Haskell is best known as a writer, scientist, and sound recordist. His work, playing its role in reminding us that life's substance and beauty emerges from relationship and interdependence. His first book, The Forest Unseen, was finalist for the 2013 Pulitzer Prize in nonfiction and received numerous other honours. And Haskell's latest book, The Songs of Trees, examines the life-giving links between people and trees. And this book was winner of the 2020 RS Book Award and the 2018 John Burroughs Medal, and was named one of the best science books of 2017 by Science Friday, amongst also receiving many other honours. Haskell received his BA from the University of Oxford and his PhD from Cornell University. He is a Guggenheim Fellow and Professor at the University of the South in Sewanee in Tennessee, hope I pronounced that correctly, where his classes have received national attention for combining action in the community with contemplative practice. In addition to his books, he has published scientific papers, essays, poems, and op-eds. So I really enjoyed this conversation with David. His sharp intellect and poetic musings really kept me on my toes, and he offered many invitations for us to deepen into our earthly, animal, sensuous, fleshly existence and the ways in which we can deepen our connection to the world around us. So please enjoy this conversation. All of the links and resources that were mentioned in this conversation can be found over at medicinepath.net/birdsong. Let's get straight into it. I trust that you will find value in this dialogue to carry with you on your own path forward. I'm really quite stoked that you have been generous with your time to come on the show and engage me in conversation, because after diving into some of your work, I was really quite amazed and impressed at the far-reaching influence that you've had with your creative endeavors, as I wasn't previously aware, not only through the books that you've published, but through the many articles that you've written in quite well-respected publications such as Emergence Magazine, the New York Times, and not to mention your speech at TEDx Nashville, which I just watched last night and I really enjoyed tuning into. Yeah, so firstly, I just wanted to say how appreciative I am of you taking the time out of your evening to spend some time with me. So thank you, David.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a delight to connect here in this through the ether, whatever it is, these little vibrating electrons that connect us across continents. So thank you. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, totally. Me too. So
tell me the pronunciation of your name. Is it Caillou?
Caillou,
okay.
or Kai for short.
Okay, great. Yeah. Thanks, Kai. I want to make sure I'm using the right name.
Yeah, totally. And your last name is pronounced pretty basically Haskell. Yeah.
Sure. But I answer to all kinds of different things, so, including "Hey, dummy."
Yeah, be careful what you wish for, huh?
Yeah.
So cool. So you're the author of The Forest Unseen and The Songs of Trees, both of which I have myself recognized have received a lot of praise and various awards over the years, and I certainly want to explore various themes in regards to these books. But firstly, the way that I love to open up these conversations with my guests is by asking what my guest's relationship is to the sacred, or to honoring the sacred, or to remembering the sacred. And you yourself, having spent so much time amongst the rustling of foliage or the furry bark of the trees and the echoes contained therein and the myriad of life forms in the forest floor and beyond, I'm certainly very interested to hear the way that you articulate your relationship to the sacred and what that actually looks like for you as a practice on a day-to-day basis.
No, that's a wonderful question, and it's of course an enormous question.
It is indeed.
And when I hear the word sacred, the first response in my mind is mystery. And I think we have to approach any mystery or unknown with a certain amount of humility. And so my first answer would be, I don't know what the sacred is. I can't know in the sense that a mathematician would know a mathematical proof, or even that we could know something with a little less certainty than a mathematical proof, but say through a scientific experiment, which is never proves anything, but certainly gets us to a fair degree of certainty about at least some questions. The sacred for me, in my own life comes really through community and interconnection. And one means for community and interconnection to manifest is through the human part of the community of life, through close relationships with other people, through bonds of reciprocity and love and connection. I think we get a glimpse of what the sacred is. And then more generally through our cultures, through what we learn through others, and particularly through the others that have come before us, either living elders or the elders who've long since departed what we'd regard as the physical manifestation of their bodies, and whose stories come down to us, either through oral traditions, things that we hear from our parents and grandparents and people, all elders in the community, or more recently, of course, in the written word, through the poetry and the novels and the scripture, but also I'd say the music and the visual art, these all ways of understanding who we are in relation to each other. And so I sense those aromas of the sacred coming through, even when I'm reading a novel that isn't on its surface really about anything but exploring some aspect of human relationships, telling a really great story. But in doing that, we're getting into truths that transcend the self, and that teach us something about how we might relate one to another. Sometimes we learn that sort of in a negative sense of, wow, here's a character in this novel that's like showing me like who I don't want to be, and I hope I'm not like this person. And that's another way of knowing the sacred, is there's the dark and the light, and we have to discern between them. But then also, and really importantly for me, is this sense of transcending the self in the relationship with other beings, non-human beings, trees or living waters or birds, insects, or the whole manifestation of life's community. And in that realm, the mystery deepens, because of course our language is, and our ways of connecting is much harder to grasp full meaning. Like when I'm speaking a sentence now in the English language, people who know the English language will be able to understand at least most of my meaning on the surface, and maybe some of the stuff that's underneath it as well. When I'm listening to a bird or the sounds of the winds in the trees, if I really pay attention, I can understand things there. There's a lot to be learned. It's not like we're broken off, walled off from these other beings, but also there's a danger of projecting things. If I hear a bird that sounds very mournful to me or very happy, well, that's me imposing what a human sense. The bird may sound mournful in a human sonic context, but actually it's that bird may be feeling very happy or lusty or territorial, or maybe it's mournful, but most likely it isn't. And so I do think in listening to other species, we need to have that humility to understand that whatever we hear is an interpretation, but through those interpretations, we come to know that great, magnificent community of life imperfectly. And to me, that's the sacred. And so I think, and I think I ended an essay I wrote for Emergence magazine on the aromas of trees, of the sacred isn't something that descends on us from on high, from some other place. It's almost like an aroma rising up from the soil. From the living earth. And by an aroma, I mean something that is not immediately tangible, but is very real. And aromas, those chemical messages that we smell with our noses, are relationships among beings, and they're ephemeral, and we catch the edge of one, and then it disappears. And to me, that's what the sacred is. Now that's not incompatible with things coming down from above, whether they're meteorites or insights or even some sort of mystical realms, that I'm open to those possibilities. But for me in my own life, the most direct way that I feel this is when I'm smelling the bark of a tree, or the aroma of tea leaves coming up from a mug of tea at breakfast time, or in a conversation with another person. And those things seem so real and life-giving and joyful. And to me, that's what the sacred is. And I don't currently have a practice of going into places of worship, but I don't think that spirit of humility and of listening is necessarily confined to a physical structure, although I deeply respect and have at times in my life taken part in religious ceremonies in those structures. So it's not that I think that's wrong or incorrect and so on, but at present, when I'm walking in a mountain forest or on the prairie, or listening to the voices of other people, that's where the sacred comes to me. And the practice has got to be to pay attention to that and honor that, and not go through life without being grateful for those gifts. And that's a challenge. Lots of days I'm like tied up in my own concerns and anxieties and whatnot, and I don't do enough to remember those things.
Yeah, it's a very lovely and poetic way of putting it. And when you touch on the nature of humanity or human consciousness to project our humanness onto other, do you think, I'm curious to gain your thoughts here on whether you think that this is something that we have kind of given up in a sense with the technological progression and just the evolution of humans and consciousness in general from, let's just say our archaic primitive times as hunter-gatherers up until our modern era where we are immersed in modern day society and culture. Do you think that we were more in tune back then and that we weren't projecting our own humanness onto it and we were kind of transcending the human qualities of ourselves and being able to tap into this kind of universality of language?
I think in part, quite possibly. I do think, though, that to be a human has always, and to be a human that wants to listen to the voices of birds and trees or even of other human beings, there's always this tension. And I think there are some particular challenges right now in our modern era. We could talk about those in a moment maybe, but I do think there's this tension between our sensory biases that make us attracted to certain forms of speech and so on, and want to tell human-like stories about other species, which is a way of empathizing. It's like, we're humans. How else are we going to understand the world except through human senses, right? So if I think of birds as particular characters or as trees as having personalities in the way that humans do, it's like, okay, a certain amount of that is appropriate because I'm using empathetic understanding. But too much of it is inappropriate because we just diminish the otherness of trees or birds by saying, well, they're just little humanoids, when really they're not. I mean, a tree is a magnificently other being. I can use my empathy and imagination to connect to it. So there's this danger at one end of too much anthropomorphizing and so on. And then at the other end of just cutting ourselves off and of saying, well, these are just silent objects. And we have to navigate that middle path between projecting kind of simplistic human personas on other beings and just completely ignoring them as passive objects in our world. And I do think that's I don't know because I haven't inhabited the mind of our ancestors from tens of thousands of years ago, but I imagine it's always been a challenge, and there have been particular people within our communities who have been better or worse at doing that. And that's part of the joy of the diversity of humanity. Some of us are really great at making tools and innovating new ways of doing things. Others are really good at caring for the sick or imagining new possibilities. Others are pretty good at tapping into the voices of the soil and the rivers and so on. Very few people can do all of those things really well. So I would imagine in cultures past that there would have been that same diversity. There would have been people who are like able to navigate that middle path and be super connected in to other species. And then others who are a lot more inwardly turned. It's like, no, I just want to, mess around with my like human tools or worry about the human social dynamics in our group, which are like really important to our survival and well-being. These days, we've got so many technologies around us that distract us, that call our attention away. And I think David Abram, who wrote The Spell of the Sensuous and has a great essay in Emergence magazine, it's called Magic and the Machine, talking about why it is we want to hear our cell phones and even our fridges and cars talk to us. He makes a case that this is a replacement for the voices of birds and trees and rocks that our ancestors and still many people today, particularly in oral cultures, still hear speaking, not as in a metaphorical way, but in a literal way. And so technology tries to fill that hunger, but it's filling it with just more human voices, which I think rightly he regards as a problem. So we got technological distractions, and then we also have ways of thinking. And of course, in Western science, there's been this mode of not just treating living organisms as if they were objects, but regarding them completely as objects, as just dead machines. Descartes, and then basically the whole arc of Western science has had a very strong theme that, and this is why we treat lab animals so appallingly. A lot of people still to this day regard them as basically machines that don't have, shouldn't have agency and so on. I do think that's changing as people wake up to the magnificent diversity of life and the otherness of personhood in different parts of the animal, plant, fungal, soil, rivers, kingdoms, queendoms. So I do think there's a way of thinking that also shuts things off. And certainly in my own scientific education, I had almost no encouragement to go out and actually listen firsthand to the woods and the birds in the forest. It was always like through ideas and theories and so on. And I love ideas and theories. You can't work in the world without them. But there has to be a balance. It's like, yeah, we got all these human ideas, and then we just need to go out and shut up and listen for change. And that would be my hope for education. And as a teacher, I try and offer that to my students, is opportunities for the world to just speak to us without it being filtered through our human ways of thinking.
Yeah, it's interesting when you touch on technology and distractions and certain modes of thinking, because when I was exploring your site, you have found a way to mingle yourself with technology in a way that seems to be almost like expanding or extrapolating or somehow tapping into something beyond our human sensory antenna or our human sensory capabilities. And that was when I found your audio recordings of the songs of the trees. And I want to get into that in a minute. But firstly, just to lay the groundwork or the context for our listeners for what it is that we're actually talking about. Well, I'll put it this way. When I think of Songs of the Trees, I am thinking about not only the acoustic or the audible aspect of what we consider a song to be, but the many different, perhaps, languages or pathways of communication that a tree might be communicating to other trees or to other. And in a sense, I get the sense that there is an imaginative quality, as you kind of briefly alluded to earlier, to this, where we are extrapolating and expanding our human sensory capabilities to what other species or what other elements might be picking up on. And of course, there is the dichotomy there of projecting and actually trying to feel into what the other might be perceiving. So we could be talking about anything from the textures of the bark to the rustling of the leaves to the microbiota intertwined within the roots, or the energetic qualities of the trees or the chemical constituents and so on and so forth. And I get a sense that you might be talking about something similar here, but to me, this is what perhaps might constitute aspects of the song of any particular tree. But I'm certainly keen to know what your perspective is here and how you articulate this in reference to the songs of the trees.
Yeah, I mean, I think you did a beautiful job of outlining the many meanings of the word song, and this is why I used that term in the title of the book. That the song is, as with a human song, there's an acoustic dimension to it, and it's really important to focus our attention and open our ears to that acoustic dimension. Every tree, different tree species, has its own sound, and every individual tree even has its own sound. At different times of year, the sound of the tree changes. And what would it be to know every tree around where we live just by ear, the way many people can identify trees by sight, or by touch, or by aroma? There's an oral component to it that we're very used to think about when we talk about birds. Oh yeah, butcher bird sounds different from a duck, obviously. Well, how does a she oak differ from a banksia by ear, right? And how about the different seasons and so on, the different kinds of wind and rain that fall into the leaves. And so part of the meaning of song is to draw people's attention to that marvelous physical diversity of acoustic experience in the world. So that's the first layer. And if we just stop there, I think it would be marvelous. What would it be to have websites and CDs where people could train themselves? Okay, I'm going to listen to these different trees on my CD or on the computer, and then I'm going to go outside, having learned something about the sounds of trees, to go and listen to them a little more. So that's but then, of course, in a human song, there's the acoustic element, and then there's also the meanings behind the music, the emotional context, the words that convey various stories and narratives, some of them quite simple, some quite complex. So in the present moment, in that acoustics, there are embedded multiple stories and layers of often relationship among different people. But that song also isn't just of the moment, it has a history. So many of the songs that we sing to one another, yeah, like we might invent them in the moment, but mostly it's something that we wrote a few weeks ago, or that we learned from a friend like 5 years ago. Or some songs are really ancient, they're thousands of years old, being passed down, and maybe they've changed. Maybe different communities have different varieties of them. Maybe we change them in the moment because of inspiration or as a little joke or something. But there's a deep history as well to songs as well. And then that's true of the songs of trees as well, because trees have been around for 400 million years. The human species in our modern form, a few 100,000 maybe. So the history of their songs is like much, much older. And then songs are also about interconnection. It's not just the whole point of us. I mean, you can sing a song on your own, that's fine. But most songs are sung to reach out to others. And trees, I call them the great connectors, because trees are the champion networkers in most ecosystems. And so the song is a way that the tree reaches out into the rest of the world and draws other beings into relationship and brings life around. And it even happens after the tree is dead. One of the chapters in the book is about a great big ash tree that fell down in Tennessee, and I've been following this tree for years now. That dead tree is giving so much life back to the forest. So its song persists after what we would normally regard as its death. Now, death for trees is kind of a hazy zone. It's not quite so clearly delineated as it is maybe in humans. Although we have our own transitions and blurriness around that time. But so song has these multiple meanings, from the present acoustics all the way into the deep story of evolutionary ecological connection into the past and the present. And so the song, in a way, it's a metaphor. It's drawing a comparison between human songs and tree songs. But in another way, I mean it quite literally, is that these trees do indeed have songs that are multi-layered and acoustically wonderful and so on. So.
Yeah, I would love to explore that with you, these recordings and the audible qualities that you've been thrusting yourself into with, your stethoscopes and your microphones, and you've had electronic sensors, all kinds of gadgets and technologies. And, as I spoke to, these are kind of outside our human sensory antenna, but I also wonder if somehow they are becoming extensions of our nervous system in one kind of strange way or another. But I would love to hear some of these experiments that you have been conducting and exploring over the years when it comes to these recordings and what you've been learning.
Sure. I mean, so my primary way of listening is through my ears, some through my hands. It's, the hand is an underappreciated instrument for listening. I mean, most musicians will understand this, but we've got 12 different kind of touch receptors in our fingertips. So if you put your hand up against a tree, like in a windstorm, or even in a big city, you can feel vibrations there that your ears can't hear. So we can hear through our hands. And people, I usually wear shoes and so on, but friends who go barefoot a lot say, they can feel a lot of that vibration coming up through the soil as well. So maybe in our plastic encased feet need to be liberated a little bit. The times I've done that, I've bloodied my feet and all the rest of it. It just hasn't worked out well. So our skin and our ears, obviously amazing ways of listening. Other ways of listening are talking to people whose lives are closely connected to trees. That's a big part of how I listen to trees. But then using technological complements to human senses has been interesting, because a lot of the vibrational energy in trees happens at wavelengths or at scales that our ears can't pick up. So, for example, as water moves through twigs, especially when the water flow slows and things get kind of dry and droughted, there's a lot of ultrasonic pops and fizzles and so on. And most of those you can't record. Even in the field, you have to bring things into the lab and cut open the plant tissues. There's some scientists in France who got some videos out on YouTube, but really interesting. You can see all these pops happening under the microscope and so on. But I did get an ultrasonic sensor from an engineering firm. Normally they use them in factories. They put them on pipes and monitor the ultrasonics in the factory pipes, because to measure the rhythms of popping and clicking, and if there's something changed, they know something bad is about to happen, and they shut things down. I don't know exactly how it all works, but
sure.
These engineers want to know what's going on inside their pipes. And so if you put one of these on a pine twig, a twig of a pine tree, you can hear in the morning there's not too many clicks and fizzles, because in the morning water is usually flowing pretty freely, but in the afternoon it gets dry and hot and things really start livening up in there. So it's a way of getting into the inner dimensions of water movement in plants through ultrasonics. Another way, and this is a way that actually I found it in some ways more compelling, because it sort of seemed more rhythmic and more connected to like human music and so on, was to put this is on a maple tree, I put a little electronic caliper on a twig, and the caliper measures how wide the twig is. So it's just a teeny weeny little clamp. It doesn't damage the twig. I just held it on with elastic bands. And it turns out that twig in the summertime, when there are leaves on the tree, during the day, the twig shrinks by just like a fraction of a hair, because the water is flowing through it. And like when we suck on a straw and we're drinking like a milkshake or something, a glass of water through a straw, the straw goes in a little bit, it contracts. Same thing happening with a twig, because the leaves are sucking water out through the twig. And then at night, it fattens back up. And this caliper measured that, and I left this thing on the tree for weeks, and then downloaded the data. And what it was like this wave that had a 24-hour cycle. So there's a heartbeat, if you like, of this tree pulsing things. The twigs fatten up at night and then shrink in the day. Fatten up at night, shrink in the day. And on really hot days, there's a much bigger heartbeat, much bigger up and down pump than on cooler days. On twigs that were shaded, it was a much more subtle up and down. But the twig is also growing. So the twig fattens day by day as well. And so you've got this growth superimposed on a daily cycle. And that is really like music. In fact, I sonified some of that. I turned the data into sound notes that you can play on a MIDI electronic piano. So it's like this crazy scales, up and down, up and down, up and down, to help people understand that when you look at a tree, it seems so like stationary and there's nothing going on there, but in fact it's pulsing in relation to the soil and the air that are drawing water through it. So it's a very, very dynamic being. Another little electronic trick is to put an accelerometer on a tree. This is a sensor that's about the size of a little bean, and it measures vibration. And every single smartphone in the world has one of these in it. It's how the smartphone tells when you turn the phone over or flip it or shake it and so on. So it's measuring vibration. It's taking motion and turning it into like electrical current. And what you can do, you stick it on the tree and you realize, wow, this tree is full of vibratory energy. Because when the wind blows through the leaves, that vibration goes back to the twigs, and every twig and branch is full of these little vibrations. And then those vibrations flow back to the trunk, and the trunk is like this great chorus a choir of vibrations meeting in one place. Just extraordinary. So within a tree, there are all sorts of different rhythms. It's very percussive, very kind of rattly sound, and every tree has its own dynamic, of course, because a tree with big, fat, wide leaves that flap slowly in the wind sounds very different from a pine tree that's trembling, or an aspen, and so on. So through these technologies, I've tried to tune into some of the hidden vibrations, if you like, and actually like measure them and bring them so people can listen to them as a spur to the imagination. So, wow, we live in this world that's full of all these hidden vibrations. You know, what else is, for one thing, those things are really cool, interesting in and of themselves. What else is there out there that we're missing? So that's part of what acoustic data is giving to us is ways for the human imagination to walk through doors into the lives of other beings. That's a stimulus to curiosity and maybe also to caring for trees. It's harder to not give a damn about forests or trees if you know that they're living beings that are just as kind of dynamic and alive as we are.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, that's really, really interesting and really amazing. Are these some of the more memorable or perhaps striking experiences, personal experiences or encounters that you've had? Or I'm also curious to know what perhaps are some of the more striking or even awe-inducing findings or experiences that you have personally had, you know, and what songs have been particularly special and left a mark on your consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, it's listening to trees is just, it's such a, on any particular day, you can go out and hang out with a tree, and it's going to be a fairly ordinary experience. And that's the whole point, right? Is that we have to go into the world with curiosity and not expect it to be like a David Attenborough nature show the whole time, that we're going to get blown away. But through the accretion of those ordinary moments, we get deeply moved. And occasionally there are things that happen that just in the moment just blow us away. You know, one of the trees that taught me, I mean, it's hard to focus it down, but I'll just pick a few. One was in the middle of Manhattan. So in like the most urban place you can imagine, there's a tree growing out of the sidewalk. I've been visiting this tree for many years now. Just go listen, literally hang out for a few hours and listen to it. And I've probably spent hundreds of hours there now. And putting the accelerometer on that tree made me realize how every time a truck went past or a subway went past in the underground rail lines under the surface, like several flights of stairs down from this tree, every time any of that happened, there were vibrations that were flowing through the roots of this tree up into its trunk. And so I saw that tree then from then on in a totally different light, is that we know that the structure of a tree, its wood, depends on what kind of vibrations are shaking it. And so the vibrations of the city have become part of the tree itself. And that wood is a representation of the summation of 40 years of vibration, because this tree is about 40 years old, of vibration on that particular street corner. A tree growing further down the street will have a different pattern of vibrations. Its wood will be slightly different. And now when I listen to music, a guitar or a piano sounding board or a violin, I realize, wow, I'm hearing the second song of a forest, because the way that wood is vibrating is a product of the particular experience that tree that made that violin or guitar had when it was growing, that gives it that particular acoustic property. So, you know, I'm hearing the musician, I'm hearing the composer and the human artistry and so on, of course, but I'm also hearing the particularity of that tree. So this tree in Manhattan, which is a really ordinary street tree, helped me understand music in a different way, because I understood for most musical instruments are not made out of street trees. They're made out of trees that grew in the forest. And it was the wind that structured them, or the movements of animals on them, or in some places a few earthquakes, but it's mostly wind and rain that forms the particular structure of each tree. So through that tree, I really, I came to understand music in a different way. And I was not expecting to learn that from a street tree in Manhattan. I was expecting to learn lots of stuff about how people and trees are connected in the city, and the tree taught me that too. That was really important to me, but that was unexpected. A couple of trees that just blew my senses away were one in the Amazon rainforest, a ceibo tree, huge, bigger than all the other trees around it, an emergent tree that comes out of the canopy. I remember it was like 25 paces or something around the trunk of this tree, enormous. And there were so many other trees growing on it, like dozens of like fig trees and other things up in the canopy, that the tree itself was an ecosystem. And there were bromeliads and things up there with frogs in them. So it was also a wetland in the sky. And I had never been around another individual on the planet that was so life-giving to other beings. And of course the rainforest is full of cool stuff like toucans and poison arrow frogs and 9 different species of monkeys and uncountable numbers of insects and so on. So there's a sort of an excess of the forest itself, but this tree was a key hub in that. And spending hours sitting up there, just extraordinary sensory overload for the human senses that was humbling and gave me such a profound, deep respect for tropical forests. And also, then galvanized me into action. It's like, we need to be helping. These trees need our help. And the indigenous peoples who live in these forests have been telling us now for generations, these forests are in trouble, we need your help. So I do think a role for I don't live in a tropical forest, but I do think it's part of my role is to help elevate those stories and then to give money, material support to organizations that are trying to protect those forests, whether they're in the Amazon or on different parts of the tropics, partly because of the magnificence of the forests themselves, the fact that they are the most threatened ecosystems on the planet and contain some of the most threatened cultures on our planet. And we're all in this together. If the tropical forests go, then climate change is absolutely insane. I mean, it's already insane, but it's just going to be even more out of control. So that tree, ceibo tree in Ecuador, taught me a lot. And then another tree, this is in the US, I put a hydrophone down by the roots of a palm tree. So this is a little microphone that goes underwater. And you can use it to record fish and whales and stuff like that. I mean, I wish there were whales where I was, but, little fish and shrimp and so on. And I've been studying this tree for several years. It's a palm tree that's growing on the dunes, sand dunes, of a place that's eroding like by several meters a year, partly because of climate change and partly because dams upriver have starved the shoreline of new sand. So this is a place a shoreline that is in crisis. And this tree was like tens of meters back from the ocean when I started, and I was there on the night of a storm that pretty much ended its life. And I had a hydrophone down in the water, and I realized the power of water on tree roots and just waves in general. That what seemed to me to be like little tiny waves, I could hear the roots and the sand grains being torn apart. There was so much power in even a little lapping wave, let alone the big splashes that came from the higher part of the storm and high tide and so on. And at that point, I came to understand the power of erosion and its effect on shorelines and trees on shorelines in a very direct way by putting my ears down underwater where the tree roots were. And that, that's not quite wasn't as a magnificent, elevating experience like being in the rainforest, but it really did. It was awe-inspiring, partly because it was frightening. Like, wow, this ocean is powerful. It could take me out in an instant. And it's a powerful force reshaping shorelines all around the world, of course, and it has been for hundreds of millions of years. And I understood that in my body in a way that my mind knew it before, but my body hadn't fully understood that. So the hydrophone gave me sort of a more empathetic, embodied understanding of the nature of the ocean.
And it sounds like we're highlighting something important here, which is using technology or finding ways that we can use technology in ways that are constructive rather than destructive.
Yeah, that was the hope. And of course, that I do think most technology is not inherently good or bad. There are some that I think you'd be hard pressed to argue that they're good, but most of them, from the first human technologies like carving tools out of stone and using those stone tools to carve musical instruments and pieces of art and so on. You can use that stone tool to do evil in the world or to create beauty and interconnection and so on. And the same is true now many modern technologies. The thing that's different now, though, particularly with electronic technologies, social media ones especially, is that they are expressly designed to get under our skin and into our minds in ways that we're not fully aware of, and grab and hold our attention. So Instagram, it might be great for connecting with friends and all the rest. And, I have an account on there right now. I'm trying to stay the hell away from it as much as I can. But, the point of Instagram is to feed ads to us, right? And it's not like TV. Like in the old days, you watch TV and there'd be a break for the ads and you could go and get a drink or take a break. Problematic, but not so insidious. And Instagram, they have figured out exactly what activates you, what your interests are, what makes you angry, and all the rest. And without realizing it, they're feeding you a worldview. They're feeding all of us. I shouldn't say you. They're feeding all of us. We're all trapped in this together. This worldview that then folds back and changes our psychology. So I do feel that some of these algorithms are reaching into the human psyche. So, even when we know it, like I know when I'm looking through these things that I'm getting a biased view of the world, but that knowledge does not inoculate me against the power of these algorithms, because still my eye only sees certain images and reads certain forms of text that have been honed to me in particular and want to shape me. And I think that is something that a stone tool did not do. That the stone tool, we had agency over the axe head, right? Maybe it filled us with delusions of power and all the rest of it, but it was not manipulating us in quite so problematic a way as some of these modern technologies are. So, and that's, I don't know what the right answer is to, whether it's complete withdrawal from some of these problematic technologies, or whether it's finding some way of, say, going on just once a week to check out what's happening and doing what we need, and then spending 10 times as much time with trees as we do with our cell phones. So, who knows what the answer is, but there has to be an answer. If we don't think about it, we're being manipulated, and we don't have agency over our own action and attention.
Yeah. One of the ways that you allude to perhaps becoming more aware of these narratives or this big vortex of marketing that social media is pushing, perhaps it's in your book, well, it's in both of your books, but in this sense, the way that I'm thinking about it is in The Forest Unseen, which is where you explore all of these stories contained within a single square meter of old growth forest in Tennessee. I can't remember the township. Mm-hmm. Can you remind me of the name?
Yeah. So this is it's a place that's called Sewanee, Tennessee.
Sewanee, yes.
Which may be, no one quite knows the etymology of the word. It may be a Cherokee word meaning broad mountain. This is the territory of the Cherokee who were driven out in the 1800s on the Trail of Tears, sent to Oklahoma by President Andrew Jackson. So the place we now call Tennessee.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm curious to know what this journey was like for you. So did you return to the same patch day in, day out over the course of a year or whatever length of time? Because, the first thing that I think about is the quote unquote sitspot, or the medicine area as termed by the wildlife tracker and naturalist John Young. And I'm familiar with his work through his book, What the Robin Knows. If you're familiar with that, yeah, for our listeners, that's a book all about bird language, which I certainly want to touch on in a little bit, David. But firstly, I'm certainly keen to hear your journey around having your own sit spot and returning to that, and some of the major realizations that you came to along this path of, well, this particular exploration of the forest unseen.
Yes. Well, so John Young's work is wonderful. I mean, there are a number of naturalists and trackers and educators who encourage people to return to the same spot over and over again. And, my own path was through practices of meditation. So lots of religious traditions have a practice where you return day in, day out, sometimes several times a day, to a particular prayer, or to sitting down and watching the breath, or gazing at a particular sacred icon or a passage of scripture. It takes many different forms, but the key practice is repeated attention. And the mind, of course, gets distracted and says, well, I'm bored, I want to do something else, or I'm troubled about this. And the practice of meditation is you say, thank you very much, mind, but for the next half hour, I'm redirecting my attention to this particular place. And so what I did was take this, inspired mostly by Buddhist forms of meditation, Vipassana, for example, watching the breath, is take that to watching the forest. So return again and again to the same patch of forest. And instead of watching my breath, do something way more interesting and exciting. And that is watch all the creatures in this one patch of forest and see how the drama of their lives unfolds over the days and the weeks. And I went down there hundreds of times in 1 year. It wasn't every single day. Some days I went more than once. Some days I missed. But the key for my practice was to really mix it up. Go at night, in the day, when it's raining, when it's cold, when it's sunny, when I feel like it, when I don't feel like it. And return again and again with nothing but an enthusiastic openness of the senses, not expecting any particular stories or enlightenment or anything to come from this, and see where it leads me. And this is something I do now with most of my classes, particularly those that involve biology, is invite students to pick either a particular patch on campus or somewhere near where they live, or just a walk down a city street, or maybe in a park or something that they're going to repeat over and over again through the semester. And that practice of repeated attention to a single small place seems very constricting, but in fact it's liberating. It's opening this portal into deeper understanding, because we can't know the character of a place without going back again and again. Just like you can't befriend another human being just by one meeting, and then you go and meet someone else, and then someone else will say, well, okay, it's great to meet new people, but there's also a role for over years having lots of interactions with the same people, and you come to know them and befriend them and love them in all their imperfections through that relationship building. And so through that year that I wrote about in The Forest Unseen, I engaged in this practice of befriending and trying to pay attention to one square meter of forest. And then, I continue to go down there, although I haven't written about my visits to that particular patch of forest since then, to just go and sit and listen and observe. So for me, this is my own path was taking contemplative practice, by which I mean meditation, integrating that with my work as a scientist and a teacher, because I teach biology and so on. I wanted to share some of these stories in a series of essays and so on. So the book is a celebration of the life of the complex life of the other beings in the forest. We come to know our own species a little bit through that, but mostly it's about connecting with other species, because we live in such a marvelous world. But I see, particularly in the years leading up to this book, there were so few books that actually described and got into the details of the lives of these species in a way that I thought what was engaging and not just like academic textbook kind of stuff. So the desire to tell stories sort of in a way as an extension of it being a teacher, but also as a way of letting the forest teach me through this contemplative practice was how I came to this particular notion. And then in the Songs of Trees, I returned again and again to individual trees and sat and listened to the trees themselves.
Mm. Yeah, and when we're talking about listening, I guess this is the point where we come to acknowledging the very name of this creative endeavor that we're both participating in right now, which is birdsong, the language of the birds. And as we both know, it's an inextricable thread stitched into the tapestry of branch, foliage, trunk, and more. And again, you've written a couple of pieces in Emergence magazine, which are very descriptive, poetic, imaginative, and encouraging for when it comes to lending an ear to the melodies of our skyward allies, to learn more about our ecological surrounds, our immediate bioregion, to deepen our sense of belonging as well, deepening our sense of active participation in place. So again, I'm keen to hear your reflections, your musings, your journey, insights you've gained from tweaking your acoustic abilities to what we might consider these ancient ways of knowing, listening to the birdsong.
Yeah, well, the birds are, there have been birds singing on this planet for probably 150 million years. So we're listening to some pretty old wisdom there. And every species has its own context and stories. And so, when we talk about bird song or bird sounds, we're talking about a multiplicity of ways of communicating and listening. There are more than 10,000 species of birds around the planet, and they have such different social contexts, such different ecologies, and so on. And so one of the things that listening to them does is it make us appreciate some of that diversity and some of that ancient, those deep ancient stories that brought birds to where they are in the present moment. The continent of Australia has some of the deepest roots of songbirds anywhere. Tim Lowe has written a magnificent book where song began about this, that the songbirds originated, and in fact parrots originated on the continent we now call Australia, and then diversified around the world from there. And so you're living in the crucible, which sort of very ancient roots, but then not just ancient roots, but modern diversifications and contemporary manifestations of this. Every bird species is, at most a few 100,000, a few million years old. And so it's not like a bunch of living fossils. No, there are deep roots, and then tens of millions of years of innovation that overlain on top of that. So one of the most amazing places to listen to birds, partly because of the sonic diversity that's present there and the ways that the soil makes itself heard through bird songs. My own thoughts about bird song, I think about, in my experience, there are just different layers that one can go through when we hear a song. And the most obvious and the common entry point is understanding species names. Right? That's what most bird watchers and naturalists are doing. Okay, we hear that and we can name the particular species, willy wagtail or a robin or a butcherbird and so on. And that in and of itself, if we could get more people tuned into that, I think we would have a transformative effect on our relationship to other beings, because most people go through life with no ability to even do the first movement, which is naming. So think about our families and friends. We have names for all those people. We know we have names for celebrities and politicians and so on. So for human beings, naming something is giving it our attention and honoring it with personhood. And so naming different species is the first way in that. And I remember in my own life, in my late teens, early 20s, when I started to learn, I started a little early, but really when I moved to North American grad school, I really started to learn dozens and then hundreds of different bird sounds. It was like I added more extra color to my life, or even a whole new dimension, because I could lie in bed and be connected to who was singing and what was happening outside, and walk across town and know, oh, there's the downy woodpecker or the American crow and so on. Just extraordinary. And the key thing with sound is that sound travels through and around barriers. You can put up a wall but you still hear the bird song behind it. You can close your eyes and even be half asleep and you still hear those sounds. And people who work in hospice with people who are dying tell me that sound and also aroma are some of the last senses to go from us as we leave our bodies. We'll all find out in the end. I mean, it may be a different path for each of us, but sight and intellectual capabilities and so on often fade, but we're still left with sounds that people recognize and so on. So sound penetrates many barriers and reaches deep down into parts of our brain that the vision doesn't. So the first layer is just naming things. And one of the joys I have as a teacher is introducing 20-year-olds to this, who come in and, you know, they know what a duck and a crow sound like. And apart from that, like, no, I don't know. And then by the end of the semester, you know, depending on the class, it's like, okay, we know dozens or 100 different bird sounds from our region. And those students, that's the thing, you know, I'm teaching 30 years now, that's the thing I hear back from former students the most is I still remember that stuff. It enriches my life, and I'm teaching my own kids to do this. The other stuff, like all those cool theories and papers that they wrote and stuff, I mean, that was important, but tuning into the voices of the living earth, that was something that I feel like has value as a teacher to offer them. Partly because we should have all been learning this from the cradle, as our ancestors probably did. But anyway, so it transforms because we're aware of the community of life around us and its many changes. But beyond that, there are other levels. It's like, okay, we know how to name the species. Now there are multiple rhythms of the seasons. There aren't just 4 seasons or 2, like wet and dry and so on. There are hundreds. And every species has its own rhythms and so on. When the fruits are coming in on this particular bush and the robins really tune into them, or when the mayflies are hatching from the river and the swallows or the flycatchers are zoning into that and laying their eggs or delaying breeding this year. So many, it's like listening to the most complex form of music, except it's not just one composition. There are thousands of compositions all playing at the same time. So it's a marvelous and sometimes confusing and overwhelming experience. So those bird sounds connect us into the rhythmicity of life's community, I think. They also teach us about individuality. In North America, there are some birds that are like song sparrows that even with just like 10 minutes of attention, you can figure out that the different birds singing around your neighborhood are different individuals, and each has its own characteristic voice. And if you get a little tape recorder or smartphone that you record them and then visualize it, you can see, I can see or I can hear when I play it back. That's the one that is always over on the west side. And this is the one on the north. And it's not just, they don't just sound the same. Each has its own pattern, its own rhythm within the sound. Now, there are other birds that have individuality in their voices, but they're much harder for humans to tune into without technological help. Ones with really short, simple, snappy calls. Yeah, they know who all their neighbors are, but it's really hard for us to tune into it. At the other end of the spectrum, there are birds like ravens that are so darn complex that it's really difficult to get to know them individually, even though they are massively individual. And so finding the bird, the right bird to sort of introduce oneself to individuality can be challenging. But that's the other thing we can learn through bird sounds is it's not just that they're all cookie cutter photocopies of the same thing among these species. No, just like humans, each individual has its own identity, its own personality, its own history and story and so on. Then on the really big scale, we come to understand the changing nature of our world. So thinking about the sounds around me now compared to 30 years ago, and when I'm dead, but my students come after me and I've told them about soundscapes, they will then be able to relate to their grandchildren. Oh yeah, this bird used to sing here, but it's not here anymore. Or, back in the 1980s, there were none of this particular species, but now they're everywhere. This species has become really abundant. Or these ones, they used to come through in migration in April, but now it's like in May when we see them. So those kind of longer scale changes, I think, are one of the things that we can offer the future by first noticing what's going on around us and then telling people about it. I remember my grandfather telling me he grew up in the north of England and how as a young boy, the fields are just full of birdsong and so on. And now as an old man, he doesn't hear that anymore, not because he's gone deaf, but because those birds are not there anymore, because the industrialization of agriculture in that region got rid of them. Now, if he hadn't told me that, I could have maybe found it out through some scientific paper or something, but I probably wouldn't have remembered that. But to have someone in your family tell you this story sticks with you because it's got emotional charge to it. It comes as a story from someone you're kin to, and you remember it. And I now have this sort of deep visceral sense of loss in that particular part of the world. And without those stories, all we're going to have is data. And very few people get emotional about data. We get emotional about stories and relationships and so on. And so you can't tell a story unless you first paid attention to the world. So paying attention is a way of learning all these different levels of bird sound, but then of conveying what we heard to other people. Not necessarily as like major significant orations, like sit down kid, I'm going to tell you something you'll remember forever, but just like sharing it in everyday conversation, like, oh yeah, I saw the doves doing this today, or I heard this bird make this weird sound. What the hell does that mean? Just that kind of drawing in the sounds of birds and of other species into just their everyday life where they belong as part of the human network of culture, I think can be could be a very valuable thing to offer the future.
Yeah, just when you said human networks there, it got me thinking about the greater weave of creation that we as human networks slot into. And one of the things that you touch on throughout your works is this idea of ethical responsibility. And I want to get your thoughts on this, as you allude to, as participants in our larger ecological communities, it comes with certain ethical responsibilities. And the way that I typically articulate this, using very simple language, is that with our own unique human characteristics, the message that I get is that we've been bestowed the responsibility of being custodians and caretakers of the land. And having been disconnected from that for such a long time, I feel as though we are being called by Earth to remember what it means to be in right relationship with our greater web of relations, which is certainly a challenge, as we've spoken to, when we're steeped in the technological, religious, political, economical chaos of the modern world. So when it comes to these ethical responsibilities, I would love to hear how you are currently articulating this and what you think we need to become more cognizant of if we do wish to, do our part in reestablishing right relationship.
Yeah, well, I love the term you use, right relationship, there, because it contains within it the idea that we are always in relationship, and it's up to us to decide the shape of those relationships. I mean, of course, every breath that we take in, we're in relationship with the plankton in the ocean and the trees and tropical forests. And every bite of food we take, and we're in relationship, but also in our actions. Every consumer item that we buy, of course, it has its roots in a field or a mine or a forest somewhere, and we can't withdraw from those relationships. Of course, I think we should be thrifty and so on, but to be an animal is to consume other beings, and as humans, particularly now there are nearly 8 billion of us, it's incumbent on us to reflect on how those relationships ought to be shaped. The challenge is knowing how, so having a sort of general idea is I want to do the right thing. And in the past, we had pretty our moral guides were sort of handed down to us by authority figures, priests, and so on. And maybe we've lost some respect for that. And certainly, I have. I mean, within the Western tradition, the priesthood has generally abused its power, and in terms of sexual abuse, but other forms of abuse as well. And so it's not clear that those particular theistic traditions have always been on the right path. And of course, then the question is, well, where else do we turn? There are other elders within our communities that we can turn to, but and I think we need to. One of the things I've suggested in my books is to turn to our senses, to pay attention. So listening to birds and smelling trees is in fact an act that can be the foundation of right action in an ethical context. And why is that? Well, and there's a particular form of paying attention that I think is very powerful. If we are in full sensory engagement with a particular community, say a patch of forest with some people living there, or a suburban neighborhood near a city, or even in the heart of the city, it doesn't matter where it is. The key is that we've paid attention with all our senses and with our mind and emotions. When some change or some question arises, we will have an aesthetic response to that. By aesthetic, I mean a sense of beauty or ugliness. Like the neighborhood changes in this way, or the forest is altered in this way or that way. And someone who's really been deeply engaged in that has a sense of, wow, that is a beautiful thing that I see happening, or that is profoundly ugly. So the senses inform our sense of beauty, which then can be a foundation for what is right or wrong. Now, that's a very old move. A lot of people have argued that what is beautiful is right, and what is ugly and broken is wrong. And I believe that in an ecological context, but I also think there's a danger, because there are forms of beauty and aesthetics that can be superficial, right? So I can go to a golf course and it looks so green and well and beautiful, and my eyes feel at ease, and there's like a few birds flying around, well-spaced trees. It just seems like wonderful. In fact, that beauty is a lie, because it's maintained by irrigation from a dying river, by pesticides that go into the river and poison other people, and so on. It's created the sense of aesthetic beauty built on ugliness. And so beauty can be a deceiver. So then the question is, beauty can be a great guide to moral goodness, or beauty can be a deceiver. How do we tell the difference? And for me, the difference is repeated sensory engagement, preferably over decades and preferably over hundreds of centuries or thousands of years in cultures, say, that have been living in a particular area for thousands of years. In their culture, they have a deep sense of what is beauty and what is right and wrong and how it relates to beauty. For most of us, we're unrooted and we don't have that, so we need to be careful. But I think cultivating this open-ended sense of sensory engagement, and out of that comes deep beauty, which is a sense that is built on profound engagement with the community of life, an engagement that transcends the self. Because if I've spent, say, 10 years trying to get to know a particular bit of forest and the people who live around that forest through conversation, through smelling, through paying attention to the birds, listening to the rivers, and really kind of opening myself in that way, I have gone beyond my personal biases. I've invited that community of life to form a little hub in me. And that hub signals to me through many things, through my intellect and emotions and so on. But a sense of beauty integrates intellect, emotions, what we've learned from our culture, what we've learned from our senses, and what's happening around us in our environment. So restoring a sense of educating ourselves to appreciate ecological beauty, I think is an important move in our quest to find right action in the world. that right action cannot be guided just by ideas alone. It has to be guided by embodied experience, including deep listening. And one manifestation of that embodied experience is a mature sense of beauty that isn't deceiving, but is actually guiding us in the right way.
Yeah, as I'm listening to you speak, another word that I'm feeling coming into my sphere of awareness alongside beauty is the word harmony. And I don't know if that resonates with you, but when I'm thinking about beauty, I'm thinking about beauty because, you know, beauty can be very, very subjective, what we decide what's beautiful and what's ugly. But in the context of ecological harmony, for myself at least, that's where I seem to get a better sense of what is beauty in this context of what you're speaking about.
Yeah, so harmony in the sense that the rhythms and the stories are aligned as they should be, rather than being disarrayed in ways that will lead to more destruction. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned subjectivity, because obviously beauty is subjective, but I think actually deep beauty gets beyond subjectivity. Because imagine you have 10 different people who've all had deep engagement with a particular place over many years. Each one's going to have, their own take on things. But I think in transcending the limits of the self, each one will come to understand and converge on, it's not true objectivity, but come to converge on understandings that will agree one with another. Not perfectly, there'll always be differences, and some people will prefer the sunset, other people will prefer the aroma of the swamp to the aroma of the uplands, and so on. But deep experiences of beauty, I think, get us out, paradoxically, get us a little bit out of subjectivity. Whereas I think in a shallow experience of beauty, and there's nothing wrong with having a few shallow experiences of beauty, like, whoa, that was a pretty sunset, or one night, it's like, great, uplifting, and so on. But those are sort of surface titillations compared to the beauty. And sunsets in particular are pretty problematic. I mean, right now we got huge forest fires going on around here, and the sunsets are amazing. That's not a sign of a good thing. It's a sign that the forests are burning at a rate that is higher than anything that's ever been recorded again. So the so-called beautiful sunset is beautiful in a shallow level. What's ugly is what's happening to the forests that are creating that.
Yeah. What you're speaking now, I feel as though that's resonating with truth within that. Yeah, look, I want to be mindful of your time, David. So this has been great so far. What I want to do is ask you a couple more questions.
Sure.
I'm curious to know what's your message, what's your mission, what's your vision moving forward for yourself in your life and all the work that you're doing.
Right now I'm working on a book about listening and sounds and the flourishing of sounds in the world, and also the way that soundscapes are being destroyed and what we can do about that. So my hope in my writing is to elevate some of the stories of a community of life, to help people connect with that, with first a sense of wonder, and then a sense of a desire to connect their own senses to not what's written in the book, but what's actually being enacted all around them in life's community. So an inspiration to that, and then to action, and encouraging especially sensory connection. Of course, a book about sound, of course, is about sensory connection. As an educator, I do think we have a crisis of shutting off the senses. It's so much of our learning is like on a screen or on a piece of paper, and there's no encouragement to actually get in and smell the diverse aromas of soil, or to listen to the subtleties of soundscape, or even the subtleties of the human voice. So if we could, if my work can encourage some of that, I think it will be it will have been good work. Beyond that, I do hope, it's for me and my place in our culture, I think we're in a time of just massive human rights abuses in our own so-called industrialized cultures. Here in the US, we're in political crisis, of course, but also around the world, that our consumption of tropical goods and of oil are creating huge problems for other people, driving people off their homelands. And I think that's something that's become more and more front and center for me as I've studied and written about and talked to people about, particularly about forest conservation and soundscapes, is the way in which so-called environmental concerns are also human rights concerns. And the division of the human and the non-human world, really, we can't do that anymore. It's all bound up together. And so, that's something I need to learn more about myself. And it's something that I can hope to make at least some contribution as a writer towards. And then just as a citizen, continuing to be active politically and to give donations to organizations that are doing work in areas where these crises are unfolding. I think that's an important thing that we can do. As for years, I still don't have that much money, but is just even like $10 here and there, I feel it's important to have a practice to say, of what I receive, I'm going to give a certain cut back out into the community, whether I'm receiving more or less. If I can afford it and make it happen, I want to do that. So, there's my work, but then there's just the daily practice. If we all did that, if everyone just gave 5-10% back, we'd be making some massively more progress in confronting some of these crises.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. Yeah, I get the sense that you are a mentor, role model, teacher to many. So I'm curious to know who you consider to be your role models or mentors or teachers that have greatly informed the work that you've done and the person that you've become.
Yeah, in my life, I haven't had single sort of mentors who've transformed everything for me. It's been a community of teachers, teachers in school who opened my eyes to the marvels of the microscopic, the cellular basis of life, which I still find fascinating, although that's not my primary area of research. Teachers who opened my ears to poetry and literature. And there were things that I've tried to put together in my own work now, of course, and then on through university and grad school, people who gave their time to encourage me in that. And as an educator, I try and do that for other people, pass along the favor to others. As a writer, I find people like Jane Goodall and Rachel Carson particularly inspiring. And my work in no way is comparable either in literary quality or in affecting the world to theirs. But I find them just so inspiring because they, in their own way, took a lot of personal risk to go against what they were told they ought to be doing. In a way that I still find pretty hard to do myself, to my shame, that I should be more brave about those things. And then opened all of our imaginations to things that we hadn't been paying attention to. So for Rachel Carson, it was the life of the sea at first through her beautiful writings about the sea. And then of course, the pesticides, which is mostly remembered for, but she was a magnificent writer about other realms too. And was just pilloried and went through terrible times because of that. And then Jane Goodall, who extended the bounds of imagination and empathetic understanding through both her scientific work and her writing for a more general audience, to say, humans are not the only beings that have personhood. Here, let me take you by the hand and show you in a way that it isn't preachy or tell you what to think, but I'm going to tell these stories that are going to transform you from the inside out. And those books, from the 60s and 70s, some of them written before I was even born, I think shifted things in a way that I find we need another shift now. A further expansion of our empathetic understanding and concern. And writers who've done that in the past, I think, are for me particularly inspiring. Even though, you know, I obviously never met Rachel Carson, I haven't met Jane Goodall either. So, but I feel like their work has kind of gotten into my skin, and as people to whom I sort of offer up gratitude for making that possible for the rest of us, and hopefully the rest of us can continue their work in new ways, in ways that they weren't able to do because of the limitations of their time and their society and so on.
You've certainly piqued my curiosity to dive a little bit deeper into their work, so thank you for that. Well, before we wrap things up, I will have all of the links that you have sent me and any of the resources or bits and pieces that we've mentioned within our conversation in the show notes to this episode. Is there anywhere in particular where you want to send people? I know your website is dghaskell.com.
Yes, I mean, so I would, the place I would encourage people to go is to find a tree and a bird and give it your attention and just do an experiment for the next month. Like literally pick a particular tree or a particular area with some birds in it and so on, and say, I'm going to give it my attention, like just for like a few seconds or a minute every single day that I can manage, and see where that leads you. So, you know, of course, I'd love it if people read my work and so on, but, you know, the primary homework and invitation that I offer people is to go out there and befriend some other beings and see what you learn. And I'm sure it will be interesting, particularly if you go out there with the spirit of open curiosity.
Yes, beautiful closing remarks. Thanks again for joining me on the show today, David. It's much appreciated, mate.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to connect over these many hundreds of kilometers here. I hope we meet in person one day.
Hey everyone, as we close up another episode, I want to extend my thanks for tuning into Birdsong. And I would also love to extend a warm invitation to say that if you value what Birdsong is all about, if you find these episodes insightful or inspiring, then please consider offering a little support in helping with the expansion and deepening of this show. There's a few ways which you can do that. You can subscribe on all the usual media channels, which includes Spotify, YouTube, or any of your favorite podcasting apps. And it is also very warmly welcomed if you share this episode with community, whether through social media or face-to-face. If you are willing to go the extra mile, please leave a rating and a review on iTunes, as it helps others recognize the value in this show. And I know just how many times I have overlooked or ignored this invitation through listening to other podcasts, but having now stepped into the role of host and creator of a show, I now recognize how much it really helps with the expansion of things. So to make it easy, I've added a direct link in the description of this episode for you to leave a rating and a review relatively easily. Lastly, please check out our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/ckmedicinepath, all one word. And for the smallest of contributions, such as $2 per month, which all adds up to make such a big difference, it really helps with the behind the scenes unfolding of the show, such as website hosting, maintenance, pre-conversation research, the editing process, getting in-depth show notes written up, and all the rest of it. So I would be stoked to have your support in that way to help assist the vision here with Birdsong. Big thank you to everyone who has offered their support through Patreon or through sharing the show with others or through leaving a rating and a review. Again, all the links can be found in the description to this episode, or you can jump straight over to medicinepath.net/birdsong for more information. Once again, thanks for being here. I will leave it at that, and I'm trusting that this listening was and will continue to be as fruitful as birdsong on morning wind. I'm your host, Kayu Kiora. Blessings on the path forward, and until next time, all our relations.